The young and the restless spoilers shock. After Damian's death, a grim silence fell over Genoa city, one that echoed not only in its empty corridors but within Lily's broken soul. The weight of grief was not just unbearable, it was paralyzing, a slow suffocation under the pressure of everything she had lost. Damian had been more than a lover, he was a lifeline she never realized she depended on until the moment it snapped. The tragedy had consumed her, and in its place, left only the hollow resolve to survive. That resolve, however, was born not out of strength but necessity. There was no one left to catch her, no reason left to hope, yet she still put one foot in front of the other because that was all she knew to do. The cruel irony of love was that it brought both the highest bliss and the most devastating agony. Damian had been her joy, her future, her chance at something pure after years of chaos, but in the end, he was also the source of the deepest wound she had ever carried. And as she stood by his grave, with trembling hands and silent sobs, she could not shake the sense that something darker lingered behind his death, something that went far beyond fate. It was not long before that darkness revealed a name, Cain. The very man Lily had once pledged her life to. The father of her children. The one who had sworn to protect her from the world had now become the monster that dismantled it. Jealousy was a corrosive thing, subtle and silent until it devoured everything in its path, and Cain had let it fester unchecked. Watching Lily fall in love with Damian had cracked something inside him, something primal and possessive that twisted love into obsession and resentment. What had started as veiled hostility grew into a hatred so consuming that, in the end, Cain could no longer restrain himself. He had orchestrated Damian's death with a precision that chilled the blood, an act not born of impulse but of cold calculation. And yet, in the days following the murder, Cain wore the mask of sorrow well. He attended the memorial. He comforted Lily. He sent flowers and shed tears on command, all while hiding the blood on his hands. But evil has a way of staining the soul, and it did not take long for the mask to begin slipping. Unbeknownst to Cain, a storm was brewing in Genoa city, one that would leave even more destruction in its wake. Amy, Damian's mother, had recently arrived in town, blissfully unaware that her son was no longer among the living. She had come to reconnect, to surprise Damian with her presence, and perhaps to repair the years of distance that once separated them. But what awaited her was not reconciliation, it was silence, suspicion, and eventually, death. When Amy began asking too many questions, when her grief turned into determination to uncover the truth behind her son's demise, she unknowingly painted a target on her back. Cain, now driven by a paranoia that matched his guilt, saw Amy not as a grieving mother but as a threat. And so, with the same twisted logic that had justified Damian's murder, he poisoned her. It was a slow, cruel death masked as illness. By the time she collapsed, Cain had already begun rehearsing his condolences. 2 lives lost, mother and son, both silenced by the same hand, and no one the wiser. Lily, still reeling from Damian's loss, was the last to see the pattern. At first, her grief clouded everything. She did not suspect Cain, even as he inserted himself more and more into her life again, offering help, comfort, and stability. He had always known how to present himself as the perfect man at just the right moment. But grief has a way of sharpening intuition, and as the days turned into weeks, the pieces began to align. The timing of Cain's reappearances. The look in his eyes when he spoke of Damian. The way he flinched whenever Amy's name was mentioned. And then, finally, a single detail? A voicemail Damian had left that she had never listened to, one where he mentioned fearing for his life, and the man he feared was someone close to her. From that moment, everything shifted. Horror, disbelief, revulsion, all of it flooded through Lily as she replayed every memory, every encounter with Cain, now seen through the lens of betrayal. She could barely stand to look at him, let alone speak. When she confronted him, her voice was calm, but her eyes held a fury he had never seen. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply told him that whatever remained between them had died the moment he killed Damian. But Cain, ever the manipulator, refused to accept that. In his mind, what he did was born out of love. Twisted, yes, but love nonetheless. He believed Lily would understand one day. That her pain would fade and the memories of Damian would lose their sting. That she would remember what they once had and return to him. And slowly, methodically, he began his campaign, not of threats, but of seduction. He visited the children more often. He helped with errands. He cooked Lily's favorite meals and left them at her door. He sent letters, not apologizing, but reminiscing, weaving a narrative of destiny that always pointed back to them. And though Lily's disgust was real and raw, a part of her began to falter. Not because she forgave him. Not because she forgot. But because love, when tangled in history, can become a labyrinth impossible to escape. There were nights she cried not just for Damian, but for what Cain used to be. The man she once trusted. The father of her children. The man who had held her when no one else would. And in those moments of weakness, the boundaries blurred. It terrified her. She began to question her own strength, her own judgment. How could she even consider speaking to him again? Was grief distorting her mind, or was love playing its cruel tricks once more? The conflict within her grew unbearable. She hated Cain for what he had done, but part of her still remembered the touch of his hand, the sound of his voice, the way he once looked at her with unshakable devotion. And Cain, sensing that sliver of hesitation, pushed further. He played the role of the redeemed man, the misunderstood soul. He painted himself as a victim of his own brokenness, a man whose love had driven him mad, and now sought only forgiveness. He cried in front of her, not crocodile tears, but genuine sobs pulled from some place deep within, and Lily found herself paralyzed. Was she seeing the remnants of the man she loved or the last manipulative act of a murderer? The line was no longer clear. As the days went on, Lily isolated herself more and more, caught in a spiral of trauma, confusion, and emotional paralysis. Friends reached out, but she pushed them away. She no longer trusted her heart, her instincts, or her own reflection. She visited Damian's grave daily, sometimes speaking to him as if he were still there, begging for a sign. One evening, she collapsed beside the headstone, exhausted from holding in the storm. In that moment of collapse, she realized something terrifying. She didn't know who she was anymore. Was she a woman grieving her soulmate? A mother trying to shield her children? Or a broken soul still shackled to a man who had destroyed everything she loved? And Cain, always watching from a distance, believed time was on his side. He believed that the chaos would settle, that Lily would come to see his devotion as salvation rather than madness. He believed that love, no matter how fractured, could be resurrected from even the darkest ashes. But what he failed to understand was that Lily had changed. Death had changed her. Pain had changed her. And though she was still lost in the fog, something within her was awakening. A quiet fury. A need for justice. A desire to expose the truth, not just to the world, but to herself. She would not be his victim. She would not let history rewrite itself into a twisted love story. Damian's voice still echoed in her mind, and now, so did Amy's. And in their names, Lily would rise. Not to reconcile, but to reclaim her own voice, her own strength, and her own future. Even if it meant burning the past to the ground. Underneath the soft veil of grief, Lily had begun to craft something sharp, something cold and calculated. It started as a whisper, the faintest pulse of rage beneath the fog of heartbreak, but it grew stronger with every passing day. She no longer cried at Damian's grave. She no longer wandered through the house like a ghost. The weight of her sorrow had not disappeared, it had simply evolved into resolve. Lily had made a decision that, no matter the cost, she would bring justice to the names of Damian and Amy. Revenge was no longer a fleeting thought born out of grief, it had become her purpose, the only thing anchoring her to the present. But revenge required patience, and Lily, once driven by emotion, was now learning the cold discipline of restraint. Because Kane was not a man who could be taken down easily. Not anymore. Since his return to Nice, Kane had carefully rebuilt his empire, not just in business, but in power. He was no longer just the man who betrayed love, he was now a figure cloaked in influence, wealth, and protection. A fortress of allies, staff, and ruthless loyalty surrounded him, shielding him from the consequences of his sins. People whispered about the dark rumors that followed him, but no one dared confront him. His hands might be bloody, but they were gloved in silk. Even if someone wanted to accuse him, it would go nowhere. He had invested in every angle, cultivated favors, forged alliances. And most damning of all, Kane had an alibi for the night of Damian's death. Not a vague story but documented, airtight, witnessed by enough influential figures to grant him not just freedom but a cloak of impunity. The worst part? He had no remorse. He knew what he had done. He remembered every detail. The poisoning of Amy had not been a moment of panic. It had been a second phase, part of a plan as meticulous as it was cruel. He wasn't afraid of guilt, because guilt was a luxury for weaker men. Kane had already crossed the line where morality no longer followed. He believed he had done what needed to be done. Damian had stolen something that was his, Lily. Amy had threatened to tear down everything he had rebuilt. So, in his mind, the blood on his hands was not a stain, it was a necessary seal to preserve his legacy. And in Nice, a city that lived on discretion and shadows, he felt invincible. But not everyone in Genoa City was willing to let that arrogance go unanswered. Chance Chancellor, long frustrated with the corruption that protected the powerful, had been watching Kane for months. His instincts told him something was wrong from the beginning, but the evidence had always been just out of reach. And now, with Amy's sudden death and the unraveling trauma Lily had endured, Chance was no longer content to wait for the perfect moment. He had reached a boiling point. Every piece of Kane's smirk, every careful word, every calculated move, it drove Chance closer to the edge. Kane thought he was safe because Nice was outside Genoa's jurisdiction, but that technicality meant nothing to a man like Chance who had stared injustice in the face too many times. He started pulling strings. Quietly. Discreetly. Working behind the scenes to gather international cooperation, leveraging favors from his past cases, building a case that would withstand any legal retaliation Kane might throw. He knew Kane wouldn't fall with whispers, he needed a public reckoning. But more than that, Chance knew this wasn't just a legal pursuit. It was personal. He had watched Lily crumble under the weight of lies. He had watched Amy's body lowered into the ground without a single answer. And he had seen the smirk on Kane's face, one that told the world he believed he would never be touched. That smirk haunted Chance. Still, even with his passion, Chance knew he had to be strategic. One wrong step and Kane would vanish behind lawyers and security, slipping through cracks like he always had. The trick would be to get him out of Nice, away from the shell he had built around himself. Chance's plan wasn't just to arrest Kane. It was to bring him back to Genoa City, to force him to answer for what he had done in front of those he had hurt. He wanted Kane to feel the cold weight of consequence on his neck, not behind the curtains, but in the glaring light of everything he tried to silence. To do that, Chance would need help. And the only person who could truly lure Kane out of his fortress was Lily. It was a dangerous game, one that could push Lily beyond what she was ready to face. But Chance didn't intend to force her. Instead, he confided in her, slowly, carefully, revealing only the pieces he knew she could bear. And to his surprise, Lily did not hesitate. Her voice was quiet, her eyes hollow, but her words were steady when she agreed to help. Not for vengeance. Not even for closure. But because it was the only way she could make sure Damian and Amy hadn't died for nothing. She had suffered enough. Now it was Kane's turn to answer for what he had done. And if the law could not reach him where he hid, then she would be the bait to draw him into the open. Would you like me to continue this into the next section? How Lily and Chance build the trap. Or shall we develop Kane's countermeasures and psychological decline as pressure mounts?